What happens if you start a timer and try to create the best 3D commercial you possibly can? That's exactly what I did, and in this video you will see what I learned in the process. If you haven't seen the first 2 episodes, then I have already covered the early stages of the 177-hour production. There I showed how I created the storyboard, composed music for the clip, selected the 3D car model and gave it some upgrades, built the first environment and animated the car's initial launch with gravel and dust flying. So the next thing I wanted to do was put together the main driving scene. But before I could do that, I had to figure out how to actually make the car drive. In the past, I have also done car movement just by animating everything manually, but this was on a flat surface and at slow speed. Now I needed something that would react to road bumpiness and, if possible, be controlled with a game controller. Of course, there are a couple of add-on options out there that would do the job, but I wanted to take my time and learn more about how to control the vehicle myself, and who knows, maybe even build my own add-on in the future. Before continuing, I wanted to see if there are any good solutions in Unreal Engine that I could record and bring into Blender. But at least with the standard option to control the vehicle, I didn't get enough controls to achieve realistic vehicle dynamics, so I scrapped that idea. Another option I also considered was to find some rough terrain driving footage, so I could track it and use it in my project. Even if it had resulted in realistic movement of the car, I would have been limited to whatever driving path or style was in the footage. So this left me with the only option to start coding. The first things I got working were the inputs for the remote controller. Shortly after that, I got the vehicle to move forwards and backwards on the flat surface, with all 4 wheels rotating as they should. Next, I added the turning of the vehicle. I figured that the most logical turning point of the whole vehicle should be the rear axle center. Just something I wanted to mention, because it's not the detail you usually think about in everyday life. I also set up the steering wheel to rotate as the car turns and added the turning functionality to the front wheels as well.
As you know, if you're playing regular games, then only the left joystick will turn. This is quite sudden movement. I did right joystick as well, but this has 10 times less input power, so you can really turn it quite nicely and smoothly.
While the car could now move more or less correctly on a flat surface, it didn't react to any slopes or rises, and on top of that, there was no suspension simulation. To keep things manageable, I decided to handle this part separately. This way, I could examine more precisely how the ground collision and the suspension work. After a full day of work, this is how things started to shape up.
Right now it doesn't have the suspension part, it's like stiff and always sticks to the ground. Here you can see the car follows the ground, and also I can move the car itself and it will do the same.
But what about the elephant in the room, the car suspension? Well, actually the car model doesn't even have a suspension. So we're talking about an imaginary one. But nevertheless, we still need that magical thing. Since the simulation needs to run in real time, I made a simplification. The car will never jump off the ground. This means it's like glued to the ground. But since my video script didn't include any jumps, it was a wise decision to make. It took a good chunk out of the calculations that would otherwise be needed in every simulation step. Earlier I thought that I would stitch the 2 parts of the code together, but actually that never happened. While I was working out the camera movement and playing around with the scene, the overall combo clicked for me, and I decided to leave the car movement in a straight line. This is how the driving simulation part ended up looking. But now it was time to shift my attention to building up the scene. I started the scene building process by first locking down the exact camera animation. With that in place, I could better assess which areas would be visible and needed to be filled in. I then began adding 3D objects from BlenderKit to populate the scene, and the driver came from Mixamo. By the way, if you're interested in the full version of BlenderKit, you can use the link in the description to get the 10% discount. Next, I adjusted the material colors of the objects to ensure everything blended together seamlessly. On the timeline, I chose some key moments where I fine-tuned the composition and lighting in even greater detail. One thing I thought was pretty cool was this background light, which I composed in a specific way. It adds beautiful reflections to the car and creates a convincing backdrop as the sky. Once the main things for the scene were done, I ran a quick test render. Then I fed the images into Big Lumen AI and compared the results to identify areas for improvement. I refined the scene multiple times, and as you can see, with each iteration, the results kept getting better. I also liked this AI-generated image, but it drifted too far away from my original idea, and at some point you have to decide when to stop. With each iteration, the changes become smaller, take longer time, and add less to the final result. Since I was already quite happy with the scene, I decided to move forward. One last thing I wanted to mention is that while working on the scene, I decided to split it. The beginning of this section only had 3D objects for the background, whereas the later part had a couple of AI-generated background planes as well. I had to render them with a slight overlap to blend them smoothly. Now is a good time to summarize the total time spent on the project. As you can see from the video title, the project took 177 hours, but that's only part of the story. If you're making an estimate for a client, you need to consider the full time investment. In this case, in addition to the actual working hours, there was also 173 hours of rendering. Often when I finished the section during the day, that part of the scene would render overnight. Luckily, my own add-on BlenderQ made batch rendering and project management much easier. If you're interested, go to blenderq.com and use the code SAVE25 to get 25% off. Coming back to time estimation, you should also factor in the possibility that unexpected delays can happen. At one point, I had to pause the entire project for 2 days because my PC motherboard couldn't handle the heat and needed to be replaced. Before we get to the final reveal, let's quickly go over what I did with the other scenes and what I learned throughout the project. For the next scenes, I used the same approach as before, locking down camera movement first and then building the scene accordingly. In this scene, since the camera movement was minimal, I used an image plane for the background. This saved good amount of rendering time. In post-processing, I adjusted brightness in some areas, added sharpness in others, and applied blur to better guide the viewer's attention. Next, in the side view shot, I kept the camera movement in the same direction to ensure smooth continuity between shots. One challenge here was that since the scene was not in slow motion, I had to refine the smoke effects. Embergen initially produced a smoke trail with noticeable gaps, so I had to experiment until I got the results I wanted.
The first draft was this to see if it works. Then I made a little bit refined version of the test. I thought that I would like to mask out as much as possible because I don't want to build everything in the far back. I added fog to the background, then I also added motion blur, and this gives me better visual to understand what I should focus on.
I used video references of fighter jets to analyze smoke formation and applied that in Embergen. Another thing worth mentioning is that I used Google Earth image of a harbor which had a decent resolution for the second part of the scene. However, at the beginning, where the image was heavily zoomed in, it lacked definition. I had to spend quite a bit of time adding enough detail to the 3D environment to integrate it properly into the scene. Now is a great time to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. I greatly appreciate your support. And here is the moment we've all been waiting for, the final reveal.